millionaire was out grabbing a pastry when suddenly a little girl rushed up and said to him, "Please, they're about to dump me." Shaking off the initial shock, he decided to lend the kid a hand, and soon a heartbreaking truth that brought everyone to tears came to light. Settle in and let's delve into this narrative together. I truly hope that listening to it leaves you feeling uplifted, delighted, and with a greater sense of empathy. Ultimately, I hope this serves as the perfect launchpad for a great night's sleep. And here we go. A cold winter afternoon blanketed the suburban street, a chill gently tightening the air. The small storefronts lining both sides were lit up, their golden glow spilling across the glass, marking the non-stop traffic of customers. A sleek black SUV slowed down, then stopped right in front of the familiar bakery. Alexander Reed stepped out, adjusted the collar of his coat, and pushed the door open. The shop was warmer inside, the faint scent of baking dough drifting across the counter. The staff behind the register recognized him instantly, nodding a customary greeting. They were used to Alexander popping in without ever lingering. He responded briefly, picked up the box of pre-ordered treats on the counter, and walked out with the composure typical of someone accustomed to a quiet routine. He had just stepped onto the sidewalk when a sight made him stop dead in his tracks. A girl, perhaps 8 years old, was standing right near the curb. Her thin jacket offered little protection against the increasingly dropping temperature. Her tiny hands were clasped tightly across her chest as if trying to hold on to what little warmth she had. Her hair was messy, loose strands falling over her forehead. She was staring across the street where a group of people were engaged in a loud, heated disagreement. Across the way, Marissa, a woman Alexander had never met but whose temperament he could gauge in a few seconds, was jawing with 2 police officers standing by an older car. "I told you I was just stopping for a minute," she snapped, her hands constantly waving as if trying to push away accountability. The officers were only asking her to sign a $300 violation ticket, but the more Marissa talked, the more agitated she became. Behind her, a large man named Vince stood with his arms folded, his eyes darting around, occasionally landing on Leah with a look that sent shivers down the spine. A few pedestrians began to slow down to watch. Maggie from the juice place across the street stood on her porch, clutching a freshly washed towel. Mr. Harris, the gray-haired gentleman who lived next to Leah's old apartment complex, was leaning against a lamppost railing, his gaze fixed on the girl with a knowing expression. Leah glanced over at Alexander again. She shifted slightly toward him, but her feet remained glued to the pavement, as if afraid someone would notice her intention to move. Every time Marissa turned her head, Leah instantly looked down. Her body instinctively drew inward, as though a single wrong move would lead to an immediate lashing. When the small cloth bag she was holding suddenly slipped from her grasp, Leah quickly bent down to retrieve it. But her hands were shaking too hard. The edge of the bag flipped twice before she managed to steady it. That simple action drew Alexander closer. He stood still for a moment, seemingly weighing whether or not to intervene. But what kept him from walking away were her eyes, so filled with distress that a single touch might cause her to completely break down. The argument with the police continued. Vince leaned slightly, directing a look of annoyance toward Leah, though something complex lay beneath it. Meanwhile, Marissa kept complaining about the fine, talking about her exhausting day, then shifting to blame the narrow street. Her voice grew higher as she signed each page of the ticket. Just then, Officer Jordan stepped in to manage the commotion. He signaled the onlookers to maintain distance so the process wouldn't devolve into chaos. Leah flicked her gaze toward Alexander one last time. It was a small movement, but something about it made him halt his usual stride. Perhaps it was the expectation in those tiny eyes, or maybe a familiar feeling he couldn't quite place. She rose on her toes, taking a small step toward him, then instantly stopped, as if yanked back by the terror in her heart. At that moment, Alexander took another step forward. The distance between them shrank to a few feet. Leah looked at him, her lips moving. She wanted to say something, but turned to look at her stepmother, and her gaze immediately sank. Alexander could clearly see her being torn between fear and a desperate desire for rescue. He leaned down slightly, trying to convey a sense of safety. "Are you all right, little one?" he asked, cautious but gentle enough not to startle her. Leah looked up for a very brief moment. Her eyes were moist, as if ready to overflow at any second. Then she took a tiny, almost inaudible breath. She placed one foot forward, as if crossing the final boundary of her fear. She whispered, just loud enough for Alexander to hear in the tense air. "Please, they're about to dump me!" Immediately after that sentence, Leah bolted. Her entire body pressed against his sleeve, her two hands grasping the fabric as if seeking the only anchor left. Her breathing was fast and her shoulders trembled rhythmically. Alexander was slightly surprised by the sudden action, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he stood firm so she wouldn't fall. Many eyes turned toward them. Maggie put a hand over her mouth in surprise. Mr. Harris stood up straight, his deep eyes suggesting he had anticipated this for a long time. Across the street, Marissa looked up after finishing the ticket and saw Leah clinging to Alexander. She frowned and walked toward the street with a clear look of irritation. The busy sidewalk seemed to recede behind Alexander's perception. Everything slowed for a moment. Leah still held onto his coat tightly, her head resting on his arm as if afraid he would vanish if she let go. Leah still clung to Alexander's coat as if even a strong gust of wind might wrench her away from him. Her head was rapidly turning toward the street, where Marissa stood near the police vehicle. Each time the woman looked over, Leah shrank further, her breathing clipped as she tried not to make a sound. Alexander clearly saw her small body shaking, so he slightly angled his body, forming a protective shield between her and the crowd. He wasn't sure why he was doing it, but the way her hands were tightly gripping his coat made it impossible for him to leave. Across the way, the confrontation between Marissa and the police continued. One officer was taking notes, the other asked her to stand still to finish the paperwork. Vince, tall with a stone-cold face, was constantly tapping his foot, clearly annoyed at the delay. He looked around, his eyes sweeping from the crowd to Leah and then to Alexander, as if trying to figure out what was happening. "You know, I've seen her a few times now." A low, clear male voice suddenly spoke next to Alexander. He turned and saw Mr. Harris, the gray-haired neighbor from before, who had approached. He continued, his voice hushed as if afraid of alarming Leah further. "Every time I ask, she just shakes her head and runs off. It's usually late afternoon, and she's hanging around the old building. You can tell something's not right." Alexander didn't reply immediately. He simply nodded slightly to show he was listening. Immediately after, Maggie from the juice shop also approached, holding a small towel that the girl often used to wipe tables when the shop was busy. She stood close, looking at Leah with deep sympathy. "The little one often stands outside my door," she whispered. "I tell her to come in and get warm, but she just shakes her head and looks across the street, like she's scared of someone watching her." She exhaled slowly and added, "I figured she had a good reason not to come in." Those words made Alexander sense the seriousness of the situation more clearly. Small pieces of information from strangers were unintentionally assembling into a deeply concerning picture. Leah said nothing, but the hands clutching his coat revealed more than enough. While they were talking, Vince began moving closer. He took a few steps toward Alexander, stopping just a few yards away. He looked at Leah hiding behind Alexander, then shook his head slightly in frustration. Some onlookers noticed his expression and subtly retreated, creating a clear space for the police to observe. Officer Jordan, who had been managing the crowd, left the group handling the violation and moved toward Alexander. Jordan stood directly in the walkway, shifting his position to block Vince's advance. His gaze rested lightly on the tall man as an unspoken warning. "Stop right there." Marissa finally finished signing the ticket. She tossed the pen onto the clipboard and spun around. Her eyes scanned the crowd, stopping right where Leah was tucked behind Alexander. Her face darkened. "Leah, get over here!" she called out loudly, her voice heavy with irritation. No further explanation was needed. Everyone sensed that this was not a call rooted in genuine concern. Leah immediately hunched her shoulders, her feet retreating a step closer to Alexander's. She remained silent, completely hidden behind him. Alexander clearly felt the stretching fear in her every small movement. He turned slightly, shielding her completely from Marissa's view. Jordan raised a hand toward Marissa. "Ma'am, please stay in your position. We need to finalize some information." Marissa waved her hand dismissively. "I need to take her home. She's my kid." But the way she said it convinced no one that it was an act of sincere care. Alexander looked at Leah, then at the bakery next door. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he knew the girl couldn't stay out here any longer. He leaned down and asked softly, "Do you want to go inside?" Leah didn't speak, only nodded very slightly, as if afraid a firm nod would draw attention. Alexander gently placed a hand near her shoulder to guide her and walked toward the shop door. Leah immediately followed close behind him, never straying more than half a step away. Every time someone walked by, she almost fully pressed against his coat to avoid being seen. The warmth inside the bakery made Leah blink repeatedly, as if the light and temperature here were drastically different from the world she usually inhabited. A few customers looked up when Alexander walked in with a child clinging tightly to his back. One of the staff behind the counter also watched them curiously, but no one spoke up. Alexander pulled out a chair in a secluded corner and leaned down, gesturing for Leah to sit. She sat down immediately, her hands gripping the edges of the chair as if afraid someone might suddenly drag her away. Leah's eyes were fixed on the door. And just then, Marissa scanned the street outside and realized Leah was no longer where she had been. Her expression shifted to one of intense annoyance mixed with surprise. She rushed down the sidewalk, her eyes darting everywhere. Vince behind her shrugged as if the matter had nothing to do with him, but he also instinctively glanced toward the bakery. Jordan, standing a few steps away, saw Marissa change direction and immediately brought his radio up to his ear, taking another step toward the curb to watch more closely. Maggie, standing nearby, clutched her towel as she saw Marissa looking around with an unrestrained fury. Alexander stood beside the table, looking back at Leah once to ensure she wasn't panicking. She was huddled, her hands gripping the corner of his coat as if seeking a hiding place. Through the glass, Marissa spotted a familiar small silhouette vaguely visible behind the frosted pane. She narrowed her eyes, walking quickly toward the bakery with the air of someone who had lost something belonging to them, but not out of affection. Marissa sharply tugged the glass door open, causing several customers inside to look up. From her secluded corner in the bakery, Leah sat huddled, her hands clutching the edge of her coat as if looking for something to anchor to. Through the misty glass, she saw her stepmother's silhouette looking around. Every time Marissa's eyes swept toward the shop door, Leah immediately bowed her head, her small shoulders drawing inward with extreme wariness. The sight made Alexander, standing nearby, acutely aware of the stress the girl was under. He pulled a chair toward himself and placed a small piece of pastry in front of Leah. The pastry was warm, and the steam rising from it made the atmosphere a little cozier. Leah looked at the treat as if she couldn't believe it was for her. She glanced quickly at the glass door, then raised her hand, her movements slow and even slightly shaky. She broke off a small piece, put it in her mouth, and ate slowly, as if afraid someone might suddenly snatch it away. Sam, the staff member behind the counter, wiped a glass while watching with a familiar look. He approached, lowered his voice, and spoke to Alexander. She stopped by a few times to ask for water. I always kept a small cup ready at the counter, but she rarely dared to take it. She just stood near the door every time. Alexander listened, glancing at Leah briefly before returning his gaze to Sam. He only nodded slightly, signaling that he wanted to keep everything quiet. Leah continued to eat, bite by bite, slowly but steadily. She was clearly very hungry. Her eyes softened a bit, but her back still didn't touch the chair, maintaining a posture ready to jump up at any moment. The sense of anxiety within her didn't disappear for even a second. The shop door opened gently again. Maggie walked in, holding a cup of warm water. She approached Leah's spot, set the cup down, and stepped back. "Drink this to warm up, dear," she said softly, without touching the girl. She left the water there and looked up at Alexander. Her eyes conveyed a sense of gratitude, a relief that someone had finally stepped in to address their helplessness over the past months. Outside the glass door, Marissa was still pacing back and forth, clearly impatient. She said something to Vince, and then the two of them walked toward the shop with faster, more determined steps. Vince's face was grim, his hands in his pockets, his body leaning slightly forward as if eager to rush Jordan. The police officer was still standing near the patrol car, but his eyes never left the two people approaching. He lightly placed one hand on the radio clip to his chest, as if preparing for a situation that could escalate at any moment. Inside, Alexander kept an eye on Leah. She was still seated on the edge of the chair, her feet together, her eyes focused on the glass door instead of her food. Her small body had absolutely no moment of relaxation. Alexander realized this, feeling as though she was living in a constant state of alert. This was not the reaction of a mischievous or stubborn child. It was the reaction of a child accustomed to evading and fearing. Sam continued wiping the counter but didn't stray far. He hesitated for a moment, then moved slightly closer to Alexander. "I've seen them, Marissa and her guy, arguing on this street a few times," Sam whispered. "Leah was always standing behind them, clutching that bag just like today. You could tell she barely dared to breathe." The shop door opened quietly as Mr. Harris happened to walk past. He paused, looking inside. Seeing Leah sitting in the corner, he stopped for a beat and then nodded at Alexander. That nod seemed to send a message. This wasn't the first time, and if Alexander didn't step up, no one else would dare to do so in his place. Just then, Leah jumped. She looked out the glass door, her eyes wide with worry. Following her gaze, Alexander looked outside too, and saw Marissa standing right against the door, her hands on her hips, her eyes sweeping inside. Marissa took a few more steps, standing right in front of the entrance. Her gaze locked onto Leah, who instantly bowed her head, her hands tightening their grip on the chair edge. Without waiting another second, Marissa yanked the handle and pushed the door open. The door lightly hit the wall, making a few customers jump and look up. That sound made Leah reflexively shrink inward, her head almost touching her knees. Alexander turned his body, leaning in to shield Leah even more from Marissa's view. He didn't say anything, but the action was enough to make a few customers hold their breath. Marissa entered the bakery with a rigid face, breathing heavily as if she had just run a long distance. She stopped right in the middle of the aisle, her high heels making a dry, heavy sound on the floor. The atmosphere in the shop immediately became tense. The customers sitting nearby glanced over, but no one spoke. It felt like everyone recognized this was a situation not to be meddled with. Leah instantly drew inward. She bowed her head lower, her hands hidden beneath her thighs, and clenched until her knuckles were white. The slight tremor in her small shoulders was visible to everyone, but she tried to make herself as small as possible, as if silence would keep trouble away. Alexander remained seated beside her, but leaned toward Leah, his body forming a natural barrier. No words were exchanged, but the action was enough to make Marissa hesitate for half a second before continuing. She looked at Alexander as if just realizing his presence significantly impacted the situation. Sam, standing behind the counter, took one very slow step toward Alexander. A small, subtle movement, but it was clear he was ready to act if necessary. He glanced at Leah, then back at Marissa with wary eyes. Marissa turned her body, her gaze sweeping past every customer in the shop as if checking if anyone was taking Leah's side. But instead of seeing support, she only met guarded, even annoyed looks. This made her expression even sharper. Her shoulders visibly tensed up. From the doorway, Vince leaned against the frame with a look of dissatisfaction. He glared at Alexander once, then shifted his eyes to Leah, his gaze adding to the stifling atmosphere. No one knew what was going through his mind, but the instincts of those in the shop warned them he didn't bring good intentions. Outside, Jordan still stood near the patrol car. When Marissa rushed into the shop, he had watched her, but only when he saw Vince also step inside did Jordan place his hand on his radio. He moved a little closer to the glass door to observe more clearly. Marissa approached the table where Leah was sitting. She made no secret of her intention to pull Leah away immediately, but as she moved closer, Alexander lightly placed his palm on the table, a simple gesture that instantly changed the air. Marissa stopped. Marissa. The pause didn't come from respect, but from the feeling that every eye in the shop had just focused on Alexander's action. Maggie, who was still standing near the counter, quickly moved beside Sam, her hand lightly resting on the counter's call button. She didn't say a word, but their combined presence formed an unspoken barrier, standing between Leah and those trying to get close. Leah remained still. She leaned her body against the table edge to avoid Marissa's gaze. Her breathing was steady but fragmented, each inhale seeming to catch in her chest. Her eyes were glued to the floor. She didn't dare to look up once. Marissa changed her approach. She stepped slightly to the left, looking for a way to squeeze between the table and the wall. But Sam followed, unintentionally blocking the direction she was aiming for. He didn't say anything, just stood there, his hands resting lightly on a pastry tray as an excuse. The air grew thick, and customers started glancing at each other. Everyone could see the situation was about to spin out of control. Vince, standing by the door, finally lost his patience. He stepped further inside, pulling his hand out of his pocket, his eyes narrowed as if he was about to participate in what Marissa was attempting. Customers sitting nearby immediately pushed their chairs back, creating a light scraping sound on the floor. Jordan, from outside, saw everything clearly through the storefront window. He didn't hesitate anymore. The shop door was pushed open forcefully, the bell ringing dryly and rapidly. Jordan stepped directly into the tense space. He positioned himself between Alexander and Leah, and Marissa and Vince in a single movement. People in the shop instinctively backed away, giving him the necessary space. Alexander slightly tilted his head toward Leah, checking if she was more frightened. Leah gripped the table edge tighter, but at least she didn't completely crumple like when Marissa approached. A little bit of trust was forming. However fragile, Jordan didn't need to speak immediately. His presence was enough to make everyone pause. Marissa frowned. Vince clenched his hands in his pockets, and the customers held their breath, observing Jordan stood as a barrier between the two sides, creating a distance that forced everyone to stop. Marissa slightly leaned her head back, clearly surprised by his appearance. Vince stood right by the door, his eyes shifting subtly as if trying to avoid being observed too long by the police. The atmosphere in the bakery became tensely silent, everyone holding their breath to see what would happen next. Jordan raised his hand, signaling everyone to hold their positions. The customers, who had been quietly watching, felt somewhat reassured to see him taking control. No one dared to speak up, but the anxious looks directed at Leah all indicated that the situation was far from simple. Alexander remained by the table. He observed Leah, noticing every small movement of the child. Leah was still curled up in the corner of the chair, her back not resting on anything, held rigid. Her eyes were fixed on the tabletop, her two fingers gripping the edge of his coat as if letting go would invite trouble. She didn't dare look toward her stepmother even once. Through the glass, Mr. Harris still watched from outside. When he saw Jordan step further into the shop, he took a step closer, his hands clasped in front of his chest. It was clear he and many others had seen this happen many times and could no longer stand by idly. Sam stood near the counter, leaning slightly toward Jordan. He nodded subtly to signal that Leah was truly distressed. Everyone in the shop seemed to know this girl, to have seen her appear during difficult moments, but no one had dared to inquire too deeply for fear of causing her more trouble. Jordan recognized this in Sam's eyes. Jordan leaned down slightly near Leah. "Do you want to leave here?" he asked, not forcing, but just opening a door for her to choose. Leah didn't answer in words. She just reached out and lightly grasped the edge of Alexander's coat, holding tight. The gesture was small, but said everything. Leah did not want to leave the man who had just provided her shelter. Jordan immediately noticed this. He looked at Alexander, as if evaluating whether he was someone she truly trusted or just clinging to out of panic. Alexander maintained a steady gaze. He didn't say anything, just gently placed his hand on the back of the chair behind Leah, letting her know he wasn't going anywhere. His eyes shifted back to Jordan, not challenging, not defensive, just the carefulness of someone committed to protecting the child clinging to him. Maggie took a small step forward. "I know the little one," she said, speaking up for the first time after watching. "She's asked for water at my place for many days straight, always standing right outside the door, wearing thin clothes. One day it was colder than today, and her lips were blue. I invited her in, but she was scared. She just shook her head and looked across to the other side of the street." She didn't continue, but everyone knew what the other side of the street meant. A customer sitting in the corner, Mr. Johnson, a middle-aged man with a kind face, spoke up when he heard this. "I've seen her too. One day I left the shop late. It was dark and she was still sitting on the curb, just like she was waiting for someone but too afraid to approach." These fragmented accounts gradually formed a complete picture of the life Leah was enduring, a picture no one wanted to see for an 8-year-old child. Marissa's face changed color. She awkwardly looked around to see who had spoken, then looked back at Jordan with impatience. "I need to take her home. This is a family matter. I don't want to bother anyone here." She spoke the words quickly and urgently, her hand resting on her pocket and continuously shifting as if worried about something being discovered. Vince looked at his watch, then outside, his annoyance clearly visible. He moved closer to Marissa, as if wanting to pull her away immediately, but seeing Jordan still blocking the path, he hesitated. Jordan turned toward Marissa. "Ma'am, please step to the right for me. I need to clarify the relationship between you and the child before allowing anyone to leave." Marissa stepped to the right, but her steps were heavy and reluctant. Her eyes constantly flicked toward the glass door, as if afraid someone was paying attention to her or afraid of something else that no one knew. Yet Jordan turned to Alexander. "I think you should stay close to the child. I need a few minutes to confirm the situation." Alexander nodded lightly. Although he didn't know exactly what was happening, he knew he couldn't leave Leah alone at this moment. Marissa gritted her teeth, then tossed her head toward Leah. "She is my child. We just had a little issue. I have the right to take her home." Leah heard the words, "home," and her shoulders slightly flinched. She didn't look up, but her two hands were clasped together until her knuckles were red. Alexander saw it, and he leaned toward her slightly. Unconsciously but naturally, Jordan observed that reaction. He didn't take his eyes off Leah, then looked back at Marissa. "We need to confirm the child's living conditions, especially when there are multiple witnesses stating she frequently wanders alone outside. I need your cooperation." Hearing this, Marissa became even more anxious. She touched her pocket again, her eyes scanning the door. Vince looked over at Marissa as if asking her what she planned to do next, but Jordan had stepped a little closer, clearly blocking the distance between the two of them, and Leah Alexander realized this moment couldn't be prolonged. He looked at Jordan, then at Leah. He lowered his voice just enough. "We should move the child somewhere safe temporarily before continuing this." He didn't use harsh words, just stated what needed to be said. Jordan considered the statement for a few seconds. He turned to the people around, Sam, Maggie, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Harris, all of whom nodded lightly, confirming that what they had witnessed was not a one-time occurrence. The wind outside the shop picked up, making the glass door rattle slightly. Jordan pulled his radio up to his shoulder. "I need backup here immediately. We have a child safety check situation." Marissa's eyes widened. She took half a step forward as if to object, but Jordan extended his hand, holding her firmly in place. "Stay put. Everything will be clarified." Leah sat pressed against the table edge, her eyes fixed on the tabletop, but her small hand was grasping Alexander's coat and wouldn't let go. Jordan directed his gaze outside the glass door, and just then, he raised his hand high, signaling the approaching support team. Two child services officers walked in, carrying clipboards, reporting tools, and a few files. Customers in the shop parted ways, clearing a path for them to reach the table where Alexander and Leah were seated. The atmosphere immediately changed color. The witnesses knew that the situation had escalated beyond a simple argument. Marissa flinched slightly, but immediately tried to regain her composure. She stood taller, adjusted her coat collar, and attempted to project control. Nevertheless, her hand resting on the strap of her bag kept moving constantly, unable to hide her tension. Vince retreated against the right wall, maintaining a clear distance from the child services team. He kept his head down, as if trying to avoid anyone looking at him for too long. His breathing was fast, his shoulders tensed up, enough for observant people to realize he was worried about something. Leah sat close to Alexander, but when the two officers approached, she unconsciously moved her chair a little closer, almost lightly touching his coat. Alexander looked down to check that she was okay, saying nothing but placing his hand near her chair so she knew he was right there. One of the officers, a young woman with neat tied-back hair, quickly asked Jordan, "Do you have the initial intel?" Jordan nodded. "Yes. Neighbors reported the child being alone several times and showing signs of neglect." That information made quite a few customers crane their necks. Sam, standing nearby, nodded emphatically to confirm. He took half a step forward, his voice low but firm. "I've seen her near the shop door for many days. Usually late afternoon, she stood outside for a long time." Maggie approached with a small bent notebook. She handed it to Jordan. "I noted down the consecutive days she came to ask for water. Some days it was colder than today, and she only had a thin jacket. I noticed she always looked across the street whenever I gave her water as if afraid of being spotted." The child services officer took the notebook from Jordan to examine it. Their expressions quickly became serious. This was no longer vague suspicion. Marissa immediately took half a step forward. I think everyone is misunderstanding. I've cared for her since her father passed away. Our home isn't wealthy, but I provide for her adequately. She spoke in one long sentence, then looked around as if hoping someone would confirm her words. But no one spoke up. The silence only made Marissa more uneasy. She tried to maintain a normal tone, but her hands still clutched the bag strap. Jordan didn't ask questions right away, but opened the file the support team brought. I need to confirm information about the family's financial status, he said. Please provide relevant documents. A support officer pointed to the file. When Leah's deceased father's name appeared alongside a note, the other officer opened another page. A $3,000 inheritance is noted here, she said. Transferred to the guardian immediately after he passed away 8 months ago. Jordan took the file, flipping to the next page. As soon as he did, his eyes sharpened. This amount was completely withdrawn within 3 weeks? He read each word slowly to confirm. Silence hung in the air for a few seconds. Then the eyes of nearly everyone in the bakery simultaneously turned toward Marissa. Marissa backed away slightly. I had many household bills to pay. You don't understand my circumstances. She tried to continue, but the gaze of the support team cut her off. Vince subtly nudged Marissa with his elbow, bowed his head, and whispered something in her ear. Immediately, Jordan turned to look at him. That single slight action was enough for Jordan to step forward, completely blocking Vince's line of movement. Sam nearby frowned. Maggie tilted her head, watching Vince warily. A customer near the door gently placed a coffee cup on the table, not daring to take another sip. Leah watched the scene with wide, worried eyes. She gently turned to look at Alexander, her lips pressed together as if trying to hold something back. She was scared. Not of the noise, but of what had just been mentioned, the home, the money, the days after her father's death. Jordan looked at Leah, then at Alexander. I think you should move the child to a quieter corner, he said softly. We don't want her to become more stressed. Alexander immediately stood up. Follow me, kiddo, he said gently. Leah instantly followed, her hand finding the edge of his coat as a self-protective habit. Alexander led her to a quieter corner, near the pastry display, but away from the direct view of Marissa and Vince. When they arrived, Leah sat down, her feet pulled close together. She wasn't crying, but she was visibly struggling to maintain control. Jordan briefly conferred with the support team. He pointed to the file. We need to check the spending source after the $3,000 was received. The officer nodded, marking the document. Marissa held her breath, each word from the support team seemingly increasing her panic. She swallowed hard, shifting her feet as if wanting to leave immediately. But Jordan raised his hand, making a clear, firm gesture. No one leaves this establishment. One of the two support officers headed to the shop door to call for more documentation and technical assistance. Jordan held the file, checking it again. All signs indicated the inheritance money was not used for Leah as it should have been. He looked at Leah one last time. She was still sitting close to Alexander, her hands gently shaking beneath the table. The tremor didn't just come from the cold. It came from the memory of the house where she once lived with her father. Jordan didn't hesitate further. He turned toward the door, clearly signaling the support team waiting outside. Move in. Bring the child safety assessment board. Alexander moved Leah to the back corner of the shop, where the light was softer and foot traffic was minimal. The support team draped a light blanket over her shoulders, the edges reaching her elbows, retaining some warmth. Leah sat still, her eyes fixed on Alexander's hand resting on the back of the chair beside her, a tiny safety latch in a room full of strangers. Jordan stood near the entrance, maintaining position to prevent anyone from rushing forward unexpectedly. Just by standing there, he caused everyone else to instinctively keep their distance. A support officer opened her notebook, quickly checking initial conditions. Pulse, temperature, a few old faded scratches on her wrists and ankles, chipped nails. She took brief notes, snapped a few photos of the scene in the shop. Leah wrapped in the blanket, Alexander seated beside her, Marissa looking agitated a few tables away, Vince leaning against the wall near the door. The lens quickly swept over everyone before returning to focus on the girl. "We need to log the reaction scene," the officer said, informing everyone why the camera was present. Maggie pulled a small dog-eared notebook from her apron pocket. "I noted the days and times the child stopped by," she handed it to Jordan. "From around 4:30 to 6, she was almost always lurking. Some days she stood on the curb until dark. Thin coat, blue lips, freezing hands. I invited her in, but she shook her head. She always looked across the street." Jordan quickly flipped through the pages. Dates were clearly recorded, along with brief notes on her condition, and the weather Sam was already at the counter. "I've pulled the camera footage," he said. "There are a few clips of her standing outside for a long time, and one of her sitting alone at the window table 3 days ago." He plugged a USB drive into the shop's computer, fast-forwarded, and stopped at a frame of a tiny Leah in a thin jacket, clutching her cloth bag, looking out at the street. "Here, 7:42 p.m., and this clip at 8:10 p.m. Sam noted the times, copied the clips onto a separate USB drive, and labeled it footage_Leah_bakery. Mr. Harris stood near the glass door. When he saw Jordan free up his hands, he stepped closer. "I called the housing authority twice," he said. "Once a few days after her father's passing, and again about 3 weeks ago. The apartment complex had ongoing loud arguments late into the night. I didn't want to get involved, just called for someone to come and caution them. I saw the girl standing in the hallway then, clutching her bag, barefoot." Jordan jotted down the timeline, marking it related to post-funeral period. He pulled out his official phone and called the neighborhood watch division. Urgent check on Marissa and Vince's registered address. Observe their routines, lights, foot traffic, unusual noise. The other end responded quickly. "The apartment is frequently dark, few signs of stable habitation. Neighbors next door complained about strange odors a few evenings, not consistently." Jordan wrote this down, underlining minimal activity, strange odor, unstable. A support officer quickly summarized the preliminary report. High risk of abandonment, a high risk of misuse of the $3,000 inheritance, risk of prolonged nutritional deficiency. Recommend temporary emergency removal of the child. The conclusion was concise but heavy. Sealing the scattered pieces of information into one whole, Marissa began to grow impatient. "Can I take her home now? It's too crowded here." She glanced at Jordan, then at Alexander. Jordan didn't shift his stance. "We are executing an emergency protective procedure. You will read and sign to acknowledge the temporary removal decision." He pushed the form toward Marissa. "Sign here." Marissa bit her lip, her hand hovering over the paper, her eyes quickly darting toward the door as if looking for an escape route. Vince was now outside on the sidewalk, leaning against a pillar, his phone pressed to his ear. He was making continuous calls, pacing back and forth in short bursts. Jordan motioned to a patrol officer who had just arrived. "Keep a watch from a distance, don't approach. Avoid provocation." The officer nodded, maintaining distance. His eyes on Vince. Alexander seized the opportunity to call his private attorney. "I need urgent assistance," he said briefly. "Child protection filings, request for temporary custody. I'm at the bakery on Maple Street. Send someone immediately and prepare the petition." He hung up, looking at Leah. She looked up for half a second, then looked down again. She still held the edge of the blanket, her eyes anchored on his hand. "You okay, kiddo?" Alexander asked very softly. Leah nodded so slightly that if one didn't look closely, it would seem she hadn't moved. A support officer returned from the door, holding a printout of ATM withdrawal statements obtained through an emergency channel from the local bank, a procedure available upon police request in child protection situations. The rapid withdrawal transactions clearly showed the timeline after the funeral. A large sum on day 1, another withdrawal on day 3, a third on day 7. By day 20, the balance was almost zero. "Matches the inheritance info," she said. Jordan nodded. "Mark for Financial Investigation Department transfer." "We need on-site statements," Jordan announced, "to avoid losing details." He handed papers to Maggie, Sam, Mr. Johnson, and set aside one for Mr. Harris. "Write briefly, date, time, what you saw, no speculation sign, and leave contact info." Each person put pen to paper. The handwriting was varied, the script of an elderly man, a cafe employee, a hesitant regular customer, but all pointing toward a little girl wrapped in a blanket in a quiet corner. At the makeshift table, the support officer completed the temporary removal report. One of them explained to Alexander, "Tonight, the child will be taken to a safe location, or, if you meet the temporary care requirements and are approved on site, she can stay with you tonight under supervision." Alexander looked at Leah. She looked up for a half-second, then moved her chair closer to him. The movement was enough for Jordan to understand the answer. He looked at the support officer. "Prepare the quick assessment questionnaire for the temporary caregiver." The form was opened: home structure, bedroom, food, schedule, medical contacts, transportation, backup caregiver if needed. Alexander answered concisely and clearly. The officer ticked each box. "Adequate," she said. "We will conduct random supervision checks tonight." Marissa pushed the removal form back toward Jordan. "I'll sign, but I object." Jordan clipped the paper to the binder. "The objection is noted. A hearing will be scheduled soon. For now, the child's safety is the priority." She took a half step back, closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, her gaze drifting toward the door. Vince was still on the phone outside, his voice low, his hand gestures sharp. The patrol officer outside the door had moved half a step closer, enough to deter Vince. Alexander's attorney called back. "I'm on the way. Send me photos of the report and the removal details." Alexander handed the phone to the support officer so they could exchange necessary details. "You're requesting official temporary custody tonight?" the lawyer asked over speakerphone. "Yes," Alexander replied. "Prepare the petition." The call ended in under 30 seconds. Without a wasted word, Jordan turned to Leah, lowering himself to her eye level. "We are going to take you somewhere safe. Or if you want to stay near this gentleman tonight, we will complete the paperwork right here. Which do you agree to?" Leah didn't speak. She looked at Alexander's hand, then moved her chair a little closer to him. The action was enough for Jordan to understand the answer. He looked at the support team. "Prepare the rapid assessment questionnaire for the temporary caregiver." The forms were ready. Alexander answered briefly, clearly, and precisely. The officer ticked off each requirement. "Sufficient," she confirmed. "We will conduct random supervision tonight." Maggie handed over a small envelope. "These are the receipts for the times I gave her water, not charged but logged to match the camera footage." Jordan nodded, accepting it and clipping it to the file. Nothing was pending. Jordan scanned the room, a scene fully documented: witnesses, physical evidence, living conditions, inheritance status, removal request. He returned to the makeshift table and opened a sealable evidence bag. Alexander approached. Alexander. In his hand was the black USB drive Sam had just copied. He placed it on the table, next to the intake report, pushing it decisively toward Jordan. The USB drive Alexander placed on the table was immediately taken by the technical team. Jordan signaled for the entire data set to be backed up into the police security system, along with the extraction log signed by Sam. The video clips from the shop were cross-referenced with the timestamp on the $300 violation ticket Marissa signed, helping to construct a detailed timeline. From the police issuing the fine to the moment Leah approached Alexander, every frame matched. The financial investigation unit responded rapidly. A summary report flashed on the screen. A string of aggressive ATM withdrawals depleted the entire $3,000 in just 3 weeks after the funeral. This was accompanied by numerous small payments at bars, nightclubs, and liquor stores. There were no signs of spending on the child's medical care, schooling, or nutrition. The final note made Jordan frown. No transactions related to child welfare detected. Meanwhile, Alexander's attorney filed the petition for temporary custody. The petition was drafted urgently, including witness statements, the support team's report, Maggie's confirmation, Sam's video, and the $300 violation ticket. The court clerk forwarded the file to the emergency duty judge for immediate review. The child services team also finalized the inspection of Alexander's residence. The report clearly stated, "Child's private space meets standards: hygiene, food, and reasonable schedule confirmed. Available substitute caregiver present." Leah was confirmed to stay there temporarily pending the official decision. An officer added a note: "Child shows positive safe attachment reaction to the temporary caregiver." Marissa submitted a handwritten statement claiming she had supported Leah since her husband's death. However, the statement lacked any receipts for medical or educational expenses and did not align with Maggie's recorded timeline. A more glaring error, Marissa's claim that Leah attended Hillside Elementary, matched a period when the principal confirmed the girl was not on the enrollment list. Jordan redlined that section immediately upon reading it. Outside, Vince took his phone, making continuous calls. Two of his acquaintances, known to work in the neighborhood, were assigned to talk to the witnesses. Sam received a strange call. A rough male voice. "You better stop getting involved. That camera won't prove anything anyway." Sam didn't respond, just opened his recording app and saved the entire conversation. A few minutes later, he transferred the file to Jordan along with the phone number displayed on the screen. Jordan added a line. "Witness intimidation. File saved." The neighborhood watch continued to send reports about Marissa's apartment. Electricity and water bills reported unpaid for multiple cycles, mailbox full of warning letters. Neighbors confirmed not seeing a young child in weeks. Jordan looked down at the summary chart. The details were coherently connecting. This was not just abandonment, but the misuse of assets for personal gain. Jordan created a manifest. Video footage from the bakery, witness intimidation audio recording, Maggie's logbook, Mr. Harris's testimony, neighborhood watch report, withdrawal statements, $300 violation ticket. He attached everything, signed it, and submitted it as the Emergency Child Protection Order Request dossier. That afternoon, the court held a brief session. The courtroom was sparsely populated. Only the judge, Jordan, the support team representative, Alexander's attorney, and a visibly strained Marissa. The judge reviewed the file, requesting the bakery video to be played. The image of Leah clutching Alexander's sleeve, her eyes panicked, appeared on the large screen. The courtroom fell silent. Marissa bowed her head. When the video ended, the judge quickly scribbled a few lines before looking up. The court recognizes a clear risk of abandonment and misuse of inheritance funds. The court grants temporary custody to Mr. Alexander Reed. Furthermore, Marissa and Vince are prohibited from approaching the child until a final ruling is issued. The decision was signed. On the spot, a court clerk rushed out with a photocopy for Jordan. He carefully folded it, tucked it into the file, and bowed to the judge before leaving the room. Immediately after the session, Jordan received further approval from the local prosecutor, a warrant to search Marissa's apartment for financial evidence and to verify living conditions. He called the technical squad, prepare the vehicle, filming equipment, and evidence seals. We're moving in tonight. Outside the courthouse, Marissa stood dazed. Vince stood a few yards away, his expression hardening. When Jordan and Alexander stepped out, he quickly approached, intending to say something. But two court security officers quickly intervened. "Keep your distance," one said firmly. Vince backed off, waved his hand in frustration, and retreated toward the parking lot. Security cameras captured the entire scene, including Jordan's request for an archived copy of the footage. That evening, Jordan's investigation team moved to Marissa's apartment complex. The unit was at the end of the row, the lights dim, the hallway narrow and dusty. When they arrived, the building manager was present, holding a spare key set as mandated by the court order. A few neighbors peeked out their doors, whispering, "Must be another fight. Happens every day." "Poor little kid, rarely saw her outside." Jordan nodded to the manager. "Open the door." The man slid the key into the lock. The metal scraping sound echoed softly in the quiet air. The lock turned. A moment later, the apartment door quietly swung open. Darkness poured out from within, chillingly silent. The investigation team entered Marissa's apartment as the door opened. Flashlights swept across the stained walls, dust lay thick on the floor, and the heavy smell of mildew mixed with cigarette smoke hung in the air. Jordan led the way, his body camera recording every corner. The living room was bare, save for a chair with a broken back and a low table with peeling veneer. The refrigerator was almost empty, just a few bottles of water, a half-open tub of butter, and 3 expired packages of ramen. A notice about 3 months of unpaid electricity bills was taped to the fridge door. A support officer stood in the kitchen, inventorying the remaining food for the report. Insufficient for a small child, lack of basic sustenance, signs of prolonged neglect. Jordan nodded, recording close-ups of the cabinets, the countertop, and a stack of dirty dishes. On the table in the middle of the room, they found an empty envelope addressed to Leah's deceased father, a signature below confirmed receipt of the $3,000 insurance payout. Beside it were cash withdrawal receipts and invoices from 2 downtown nightclubs. Jordan put on gloves, gathered everything into an evidence bag, and labeled it E1. "This is key," he muttered. "It shows non-legitimate use of the funds." The team moved to the bedroom. In a bedside drawer, they found pawn shop tickets, listing descriptions like blue school backpack, winter coat, souvenir engraved with LIA. An officer quietly gasped, "All children's items." Jordan noted it in the report, photographed each ticket, and sealed the second evidence bag, labeled E2. He looked around the room. Everything was a mess, the sheets rumpled, liquor bottles rolled under the bed. There was nothing belonging to a small child except an old folded photo tucked in the drawer. When they collected Marissa's abandoned phone, a technician quickly extracted the data. Text messages between her and Vince flashed on the screen. "Done with the 3K. Don't stay around long. When are we leaving this neighborhood?" "Soon. Just need to deal with the fine." Jordan took screenshots, saved the digital copies, and attached them to the report, labeled E3. That very night, Jordan contacted the pawn shop listed on the tickets. The owner confirmed receiving the listed items exactly around the time of the cash withdrawals. "I still have them in storage," the owner said over the phone. "If I have official paperwork, I'll hand them over." Jordan faxed the verification order, locking another crucial link in the case file. While the investigation team worked across the city, the support team finalized Leah's health and psychological evaluation. The report stated, "Signs of prolonged nutritional deficiency, child eating and sleeping stably in the new environment, safe attachment with temporary caregiver is forming. A comprehensive physical and therapy schedule was set up weekly." Alexander simultaneously prepared Leah's private room at his house. He placed a small bed by the window, hung light-colored curtains, and organized storybooks on a shelf. In the kitchen, he bought separate dishes, filled the fridge with milk, fruit, and the kind of pastry Leah liked from the shop. He wrote down her routine schedule for the monitoring officer: mealtime, study time, reading time, bedtime. Every detail was meticulously handwritten, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. News of the search reached Vince hours later. He immediately packed his belongings, left his temporary apartment in the South End, and drove toward the suburbs. But his license plate had been recorded at the courthouse parking lot. Jordan alerted the patrol division. "Gray pickup, plate 5, ZK349, intercept on Route 4. The information was relayed across the system, and patrol lights flashed along the route. At the same time, Marissa was summoned for further questioning. Facing the array of physical evidence, the inheritance envelope, withdrawal receipts, and texts with Vince, she lost her composure. "He forced me. It was all his idea," she cried, her voice shaking but her eyes evasive. Jordan calmly recorded her testimony. "You claim he forced you, but the pawn tickets bear your signature, and the ATM withdrawals were made with your card. Do you have any further explanation?" Marissa remained silent, her hands gripping the edge of the table. The evidence was immediately transferred to the district attorney's office. The prosecutor reviewed it, quickly flipping through the pages before signing off. Sufficient grounds for indictment, child abandonment, and theft of inheritance funds. The decision was printed, along with a schedule for the preliminary hearing within 10 days. Subpoenas were sent to Maggie's Cafe, Sam's Bakery, and the residential area where Mr. Harris lived. While all procedures were underway, Leah had her first therapy session at the center. She sat at a drawing table, asked by the specialist to draw what made her feel safe. Leah drew a small house with yellow light spilling out from the window. Set against a pale blue sky beneath the picture, she wrote in shaky handwriting, "The house with the light on." The specialist looked over at Alexander, who was sitting a few steps away, and smiled softly. "She's starting to recover," she said. In the days that followed, Alexander maintained a stable routine. Leah woke up early, ate breakfast with him, and attended a temporary school program. In the evenings, they read stories together, The monitoring team made 2 unexpected visits. All metrics were good. Inside the house with the light on drawing was taped to the refrigerator, right next to a note reading, "Dinner, vegetable soup and baked goods." As the trial date approached, Jordan met continuously with the involved parties. The witness seating was arranged, Maggie, Sam, and Mr. Harris in the front row. The financial unit presented the money flow charts, the technical team prepared the screen to project video from the bakery camera, and the courthouse parking lot Alexander's attorney reviewed the statements, ensuring all evidence was presented clearly. On the morning of the hearing, the sky was a soft gray. The city courthouse opened its doors, curious citizens standing outside. Alexander held Leah's hand as they walked across the threshold of the courtroom. She wore a pale blue dress and a small hair clip Maggie had given her. Her small hand gently squeezed his, slightly shaky but full of trust. Alexander leaned down and whispered, "We just need to tell the truth, okay?" Leah nodded. The courtroom doors opened wide. Jordan, Maggie, Sam, Mr. Harris, the support team, and the lawyer were all in position. The space was solemn, white lights shining on the judge's bench. Alexander led Leah straight to the front row between the long aisles. The courtroom was brightly lit. The judge sat center stage, the clerk's voice steady as she called the parties to order. The prosecution representative opened the file, summarizing the entire case. A clear timeline, the financial evidence trail, the $300 violation ticket serving as the starting point of the investigation, and Leah's living conditions at the time of her rescue. The room fell silent when the image of the small, frail child from the report appeared on the screen. The technical team played the video from the bakery camera. Segments appeared one after another. Leah standing outside in the cold wind, Leah secretly peering through the glass. In the afternoon, the argument occurred. The moment she tightly gripped Alexander's coat, her eyes filled with tears. A timeline chart was shown alongside the violation ticket, matching down to the minute. When the video concluded, the room remained quiet, save for the soft tapping of the judge's pen on the bench. The financial team continued the presentation. Charts projected on the large screen clearly showed the rapid ATM withdrawals, depleting the entire $3,000, followed by continuous payments at nighttime entertainment venues. The columns for Leah's food, education, and medical expenses were blank. A comparison table appeared. 0 transactions related to child welfare. Maggie was called to the witness stand. She opened her small notebook, presenting her handwritten log. Every day Leah appeared, the cold afternoons, the times she waited on the curb. She usually didn't dare to come in, only looked through the door, she said, clutching the notebook tightly. Sam followed immediately, submitting the audio recording of the strange call, asking him to retract his statement. The sound echoed in the courtroom, a gruff, concise male voice. "You better stop getting involved," Mr. Harris further confirmed. "I called the housing authority many times because of the ongoing arguments, and I saw the little one standing out in the cold." Jordan presented the search warrant file for the apartment. Images appeared. The empty refrigerator, the debt notices for utilities, the empty envelope bearing the father's name, the pawn shop tickets for Leah's belongings, and screenshots of texts between Marissa and Vince. "Done with the 3K leaving this neighborhood," Jordan spoke briefly. "All physical evidence was collected according to legal procedure and has been cross-referenced with the timeline." Alexander's attorney presented the support team's report. Leah currently had her own room, a meal plan, an educational schedule, and regular medical checkups. A photo of her room was displayed, a small bed by the window, neatly organized drawers, and the "house with the light on" drawing taped to the wall. A support officer confirmed, "The child is recovering well. Safe attachment behaviors have formed." Marissa sat in the back, her face pale. When called to testify, she vaguely explained the spending, claiming she was forced by Vince. Her lawyer contested a few small details in the financial chart, but could not produce any receipts proving care for Leah. The judge asked one last time, "Do you have any other evidence?" Marissa remained silent, her shoulders slumped. Vince was escorted in with the patrol report. He sat silently, his face tense as the video from the courthouse parking lot camera was played, recording him trying to approach Alexander after the emergency session. The audio from the call sent to Sam was also cross-referenced, the voice matching perfectly. The judge summarized the totality of the case. His voice was steady and clear. The direct and circumstantial evidence is sufficient. The risk to the child was real. The highest priority is the welfare of Leah Reed. The room was absolutely silent. He looked down, signed a line on the verdict, then looked up to read the ruling. The defendant, Marissa, is found guilty of child abandonment and misuse of inheritance funds. The defendant, Vince, is found guilty of conspiracy to intimidate witnesses and complicity in the chain of events. The sentences and rehabilitation programs are detailed in the official decree. He paused, his eyes moving to the front row where Leah was sitting next to Alexander. Official custody is hereby granted to Mr. Alexander Reed. Child Services will monitor the initial phase to ensure stability. The remaining portion of the father's inheritance will be transferred into a trust fund under Leah's name, supervised by the court. The gavel pounded. Everyone in the room stood up. Alexander slightly bowed his head, thanking the judge, then took Leah's small hand. She looked up at him, her eyes gradually brightening after months of fear. As they walked out of the courtroom, the sunlight in the hallway stretched across the floor tiles, warm and soft, signaling a new beginning. Outside the court, Jordan shook Alexander's hand. "She's safe now," he said. Alexander simply nodded, looking down at Leah clutching a small folder in her hand. He said softly, "And she'll never have to stand alone on the street again." That afternoon, they returned home. Leah ran straight to her room, flipping the hallway light switch. The yellow light cast a glow on the house with the light on drawing. Alexander paused at the door, looking around the cozy room, a place where a child who once trembled while pleading for help could now smile peacefully. On the room door, a small plaque had been mounted that very morning, inscribed with the name Leah Reed. A home with a light on. It truly belonged to the girl now, and that concludes our bedtime story for tonight. The story of a little girl named Leah and the man who changed her life. From a cold afternoon on the roadside to the moment the lights turned on in a new home, we see how kindness can turn into magic when offered at the right time. What about you? After hearing this story, who left the biggest impression on you? Was it Alexander, the mogul who chose to listen instead of walking away, or was it Leah, the brave girl who knew to ask for help to save herself? Or perhaps you empathized most with Maggie, who quietly logged every small detail to bring the truth to light. Please leave a comment below and share your thoughts on this story. I'd love to know which character you love the most and which action truly touched your heart.